Lesson 1.3, Controlling Graphics. In this lesson you will learn how to assign colors to objects. You will learn how to change line weights on objects. You will learn how to manage the attributes palette. And you will learn how to apply hatches, gradients, and line styles. Let's get back to Vectorworks. In this movie we want to learn how to use this palette here, the attributes palette. The attributes palette controls the fill, that's this part here. It controls the line around things, that's this part here. So let's just start by looking at this object here. So that's my rectangle. We'll have a look at this. It can be solid or it can have no fill, so I can see right through it. If I make it solid, I can choose a color for this. So here you can see the colors in my active document, just black and white. I've got classic Vectorworks colors, so these are my color palettes at the bottom here. It's my classic Vectorworks colors. These are my standard Vectorworks colors. So there's quite a rainbow of colors in that area. Some of these colors have got names. Some of them haven't. So why don't we just talk about this palette for a little bit. What we've got here is our color palette manager, just here. So I can choose to add extra palettes. So I might want to use Benjamin Moore colors. I might want to use Rosine colors. And there's a lot of Rosine colors I could use here. Let's do Rosine Lumbercider range. That was that one there. Let's OK that. Now when I go back to choose a color, you'll see I've got more choices. I could choose my Rosine Lumbercider range, and I could look for one. So I look for one called Sandcastle. It found one there. Did it find any others? It found two. That one, Prairie Sands. Maybe that's not quite the one I want, but it just gives you an idea of how you can find colors. Rosine's Dusty Road, for example. So that gives us the ability to choose the color, to choose the middle part of the color. You might notice that I can hear clicking noises every time I move around. Let's go just up to this area here. We'll have a look at this. This is my preferences, right down the bottom here, Vectorworks preferences. And I'm using here sound. If I turn off that sound, then it'll stop me having the clicking sounds as I move around my screen. So let's just have a look at that again. So it's got that sort of muddy color. I can choose a different color for that. I can now choose a line weight. So here I can choose a line weight. I can make my line fatter. Now it might appear to you when we choose a slightly thinner line that it doesn't change very much. So if I zoom in, you might notice that it doesn't change a lot. We've got an option here, one of our quick preferences. Now we looked at the preferences earlier on. I'll just refresh your memory. This is our button where we can choose which preferences we might want to have. I've got Auto Join Walls, Show Clip Cube, and Show Other Objects. This one here, Zoom Line Thickness. When I click on that, as I get closer to objects, the line weight will be overemphasized. So I can see that that line is slightly heavier than this one. If I choose that and make it a fatter line like we had before, it is really fat. So that's my zoom line thickness. I'm going to turn that off and fit to page area again. So there we are. So we can choose an object, we can choose the attributes, we can choose the fill, we can choose what kind of fill it's got. We can also choose the opacity. Now that might be better if I did it on this one. So let's give it a color. In fact, what I'd like to do is give it a black color. So let's make it black. Now what I'd like to do is to have a look at this option here. I want to change the opacity. So I'm going to make it semi-opaque. And you'll notice that it's gone a light gray color, but it's also see-through, so I can see right through that object. I've linked my pen opacity. If I turn that option off, I can have the solid black line, but a semi-opaque fill. That's quite cool. So let's put all of that back to 100%. And it's solid black again, and I'll put it back the way it was, as it was white. Now, nothing at the moment is selected. Up here it says no selection. Nothing here has got the blue handles on it. Now if I change my color here, if I change it now, I have changed the default attributes. The next object I draw will be using these attributes. So nothing is selected. I make my choices and I go, well, that's strange, none of these updated. Let's go back to my rectangle tool. I'll draw another rectangle. Wait a minute, why is it like that? Well, it's like that because you changed the default preferences. So when nothing is selected, set that to white, set this to a reasonably thin line, and that's fine. What we can also do with this is we can click at this little utility arrow and we can say set default attributes. So I've now saved these and I've also stored them as my default attributes. If I accidentally make them a little bit strange, let's just make them fat like that. Let's draw a rectangle. Oh no, I didn't want that. Click here, use default attributes, and you can see it set that back. Now, when I deselect everything, I've still got these strange colors. What I can do is I can use default attributes again, and so that'll reset it for me. So just be aware of that sometimes when you're doing this exercise and you're selecting and changing colors, you actually deselect the object and then you change the defaults and it doesn't stay the way you think. And when you start creating new objects, then they all start to put the colors on. So that was the first part. So let's go to the second part here. Let's look at putting a pattern on. We have a range of patterns. These light grey ones are quite useful. These other ones might appear to be useful until you print, and then they may not come out exactly the way you think. So if you're going to use patterns, click here to change the pattern. Try to stick to these sort of greyish ones, these dot ones. They produce some pretty good results of creating light grey fills. Quite handy. This allows me to change my foreground colour. This allows me to change my background colour. Very weird. Okay, let's just put that back the way it was. And white. So I could make that black and white. So black dots with a white background. Select that one again. Let's have a look. Maybe we want to use a hatch. Now when we want to use a hatch, we have the choices of all of our hatches. We have some Vectorworks libraries, defaults, and we have hatches here. And we can choose cartographic hatches, we can use detail hatches, hardscape hatches, and so on. So there are lots of hatches that we can select. You can create your own, save them to your favorites, and make them available on every job. This is a mini resource manager, if you like. It only shows up to look for hatches when you're selecting hatches. So that's my hatch. I still can play with the opacity, remember. And let's change that to a tile. So a tile is a different thing from a hatch. And there are some aggregates here that you can look at. You can also look at your Vectorworks libraries again. Let's have a look at some tile fills. There's some pavers. There are some other ones here. These are from England, Dutch paver. Some 2D ones, some brick, concrete block hatches, or tiles I should call them. And so there's a lot for you to choose from. And there are your defaults. And select. Let's go to the last one. I'd like this to be a gradient. So I choose gradient. What sort of gradients have I got? Let's look at my libraries again, defaults. Let's look at my gradients. And there are some here that are not too bad. Some of these are a little bright, maybe a nice grayscale one. So let's go back to how we can change these or how we can manipulate them. I'm just going to pull this one out here so we can see it. So this is a brick tile. This is a gradient. One of the things we can do is to click on this button here and we can change the type of gradient we've got. Linear or radial or rectangular or angular. And that will change that. But what we might want to do is control where the gradient stops and starts. There's a tool for that. There's this tool over here, the attribute mapping tool. So this attribute mapping tool has a dot for the start of the gradient, which I can then move, and a dot for the end of the gradient, which I can also move. It also has an effect on here. So if I grab that blue handle and move that in, I'm rescaling that tile. So I've actually changed the scale of that tile. If I go to the middle handle here, I can rotate it. Here I can choose to change my radial to there. Well, it's radial, so it's not really going to have a difference. Let's make that back to linear. And I can now control my linear gradient from one corner to the other. So it becomes quite a powerful tool, this one here. Allows us to change our hatches, our gradients, images, things like that. We haven't created an image yet, so I'm just going to drag a copy of this one down. So to drag a copy, you drag and then you hold your finger on the Option key on a Macintosh or the Control key on a Windows machine, and that will create a copy. We haven't looked at images, so let's look at images. We've got some images in our Vectorworks library. What sort of things do we want? Do we want concrete? Do we want carpet? There's a lot of carpety bits there. They have some stucco or some tiles or some nice wood textures. Now these textures here, I should call them images because that's really what they are. These images have got a little arrow here. These have not yet been downloaded. When I double click, it will download that from the internet, store it on my computer, so it will always be available offline from now on. So it's just downloading it. So if you ever see that little download arrow, that's what it's all about. And we can go back to our attribute mapping tool. We can change the scale of that so that it reflects what we wanted it to. The last thing I'd like to look at is line types. So I'm going to draw some lines so you can see them. So those are my lines. Remember, these also work along the same lines as the defaults that I explained earlier. I choose the line type. Here are my favorites here, or my Vectorworks libraries. Defaults, these are my default line types. I could make those into circles. I could make them into clouds. I could create clouds reversed. I can choose dashes, long dashes, and so on. Dot dashes, select that, and that's a double dot dash. Grab that one there, and I can make that one into a line type. What kind of line type do I want to use? Maybe circles. Let's select that one. And so those are my circles. You haven't got any control over these circles. They're controlled by the settings on that particular resource. This is the end of lesson 1.3. In this lesson you learned how to assign colors to objects, you learned how to change line weights on objects, you learned how to manage the attributes palette, and you learned how to apply hatches, gradients, and line styles.